Amen. Good morning, church. Hey, what's up, Caleb? How we doing? Glad to have y'all with us this morning. Happy spring forward. Everybody doing okay? We got here a little bit quicker today. Any tired eyes? A couple tired eyes. I actually saw some folks reminding people to set their clocks back last night, and they're in for a rude awakening this morning. It's not how it works, my friends. That's not how it works. It's a blessing to be here with you this morning. I love you, and I'm excited to continue studying the call and life of Abram or Abraham with you this morning. Father Abraham, maybe you've heard him called before, lived what I consider an epic life. And to be honest, we've really just started to scratch the surface of it, but it's a life filled with incredible deeds and adventures and godly interventions, and all these are aspects of a life that we probably should aspire to live ourselves. But most importantly, Abram's life is a life marked and characterized by faith, indomitable faith, resurgent faith. A life known by its character and integrity and its selflessness, by his unyielding willingness to simply just do what God asked him to do, regardless of what it was going to cost him. Easier said than done. In all of this, Abram is an example to us, something or someone to shoot at, to aspire to. But what if I told you that Abram's greatest moments aren't the prolific ones that we remember? What if even in this life, known for its faith and resolve, the moments we learn the most from are the lowest ones, when things go completely off the rails? See, we've seen Abram demonstrated as a guy who already God said, I can work with that. He's the guy with the promises of God. He's the guy that can see others before himself and put them first. He's the guy that left home inexplicably, forgetting cultural conventions, social norms, to heed the call. He's a hero, really, in any respect. So what happens when our heroes turn out to be less than perfect? We live in a society that really struggles with this. We love to build up and venerate and celebrate and idolize, and then we take even more pleasure and joy in seeing those people torn down off their pedestal. So what happens when a great hero of the faith, someone revered for how they stand, isn't torn down? They just actually fall. And the question that we might have, that we ask ourselves in our dark corners of our bedroom and our conversations with God when we're not feeling so good about ourselves, is a question we might ask of Abram after we see one of these moments today. It's, can God still work with that? And underneath of that question is the question that looms large for each and every one of us in our hearts, despite our failures and our lowest moments: can God still work with me? And then we have to go a step further, because I believe God can do anything. Of course, he could work with me, but will he work with me? Does he want to work with me? Why would he work with me? Because frankly, I wouldn't keep working with me. And then even beyond that, will I let him work with me by letting him work on me and letting him work in me? Church, what if the thing that sets the legends of the faith apart from the faithless is not whether they ever fell, but whether they ever got back up again? Are you guys familiar with the thing called Murphy's Law? I think I've shared Murphy's Law with you before, but we're really going to talk about Murphy's Law today, because not only did I plan to illustrate Murphy's Law in sight of what Abram is going to go through this morning, but a few weeks ago when I decided to do that, God started letting me live Murphy's Law a little bit every week. I became familiar with Murphy's Law when I was working as a computer systems engineer, and it's just an axiom, it's a principle that if a given thing can go wrong, it will go wrong. And the second level of Murphy's Law is that it is going to go wrong at the worst possible time. And the third level of Murphy's Law is actually that the smaller the chance of it going wrong, the more definitely it is going to go wrong. And so when I woke up yesterday and realized that I had let Ray down by not getting us a new springy theme for our background slides, and then nothing would upload, I started to giggle because, well, here comes Murphy's Law. when I need it the least. And then when I woke up this morning to review my notes for this message, and my computer said hard drive not installed. Ask Mags, I stood over that kitchen table and I just laughed. She said, are you okay? Is there anything I can do? I said, no. You can't do anything for Murphy's Law. This is just how it goes. Murphy's Law is a fact of life. But once you're aware of it, it helps you a lot because you can begin to think about what you're going to do if and when Murph inevitably shows his disgraceful face at the least opportune time, in the most pivotal moment. Because being paralyzed when Murph strikes is the worst thing you can do. So knowing how to navigate Murphy's shenanigans and knowing where you're going to go ahead of time can pay some really big dividends. What does any of this have to do with our message? Because we started off talking about Abram and heroes of the faith and falling, and now we're talking about spilled milk over your breakfast table and Murphy's Law. Let's read our text one more time, and then we're going to talk about it. This is chapter 12. We're going to start in verse 10, Abram and Sarai. Now there was a famine in the land, so Abram went down to Egypt to sojourn there, and the famine was severe in the land. When he was about to enter Egypt, he said to Sarai, his wife, I know that you are a woman beautiful in appearance. He's trying to get some brownie points here. Hey, babe, you know I love you, right? You are the most beautiful woman on the planet. And when we get there, they might try to kill me because you're so beautiful. You ever said that to your wife before you walk into like a Kohl's or something? And when the Egyptians see you, they'll say, this is his wife. Then they will kill me, but they will let you live. So say you are my sister, that it may go well with me because of you, and that my life may be spared for your sake. When Abram entered Egypt, the Egyptians saw that the woman was very beautiful. And when the princes of Pharaoh saw her, they praised her to Pharaoh. And the woman was taken into Pharaoh's house. And for her sake, he dealt well with Abram. And he had sheep and oxen and male donkeys and male servants and female donkeys and camels. So Abram is fresh off of a peak faith moment. So far in what we've learned about Abram, this man that God has called, he is pitching a perfect game. He's Nolan Ryan with it so far. And he heeds the call of God. He goes out from his people to a land which God promises him. But here's the thing. When he gets to the land, immediately after, it says that this is not the land that we come to think of, the land flowing with milk and honey. It's a famine land when he gets there. Not soon after they arrive. It's drought and famine. And this is a principle in life, that the people of God tend to experience their greatest tests right on the heels of their greatest victories. And you got to know that, church. See, remember Jesus, when he's baptized by John the Baptist, and he has the Spirit descend on him like a dove, and an audible voice from heaven says, this is my son in whom I am well pleased. There's no greater mountain peak moment than that. When he goes to start his ministry right after, he's led into a dry place, desolate in the wilderness, where he's tempted for 40 days. And this happens for Peter too, who, after making the great confession, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God, immediately slips into the flesh, and Jesus has to curve him and rebuke him to his face, saying, get behind me, Satan. Mountain peak, immediate low. And it happened to Elijah after the prolific victory over the prophets on Mount Carmel, 400 prophets of Baal. The greatest maybe victory in the history of the world, and the very next time we see him, he's crying in a cave saying, God, could you please just kill me? And God says, no, but you need some carbs. Gives him carbs. As this lesson goes way longer than it should, men, is she crazy or does she need carbs? We don't know. Your best choice is to just break some bread. That's all the advice I'm giving today. It was right. Well, let me just say before we move on from that, have you experienced this? Where you feel like things are going as good as they could possibly go, and then all of a sudden they're going as bad as they possibly could go. A mountaintop moment, maybe you felt on fire for the Lord, and then in these moments, these valleys, we find ourselves falling into things that we never thought we'd do, saying things we never thought we'd say, and maybe questioning some things that we never thought we'd question about what we believe. And so what I want us to grasp this morning is that Abram, this hero of the faith, is just like you in all these things. So Abram decides to leave the land he was promised and seek aid in Egypt. And I think it's really hard or easy to be hard on Abram here, and we should pause because we've all been in this position where we have this tension between the promises of God and our responsibility to those who depend on us. I think everybody in this room has struggled with that tension between believing God and letting God handle it and letting God do it and then waiting on God to do something, or feeling the pressure that we have to do something, we must act, because there are times where the faithful thing to do is to act. So Abram is not wrong here. It's clear he believes God's promise. The question is, does he believe it enough to risk starvation? Does he believe it enough to the loss of, or endure the loss of his few possessions and Lot and his family? So he goes to Egypt. And for some reason, this is where everyone goes in times like these. If you've been reading ahead or you know what happens in the story, you're thinking, man, nothing good ever comes out of Egypt, and that's usually true except for Jesus that one time. And you're thinking, Abram, this is going to be a bad idea, but just know that the Nile River is the source of life in this world that seems to never go dry. So that delta area that they're going to was always fertile, and there was always provision, even when the rest of the world was covered in famine. And so Abram makes the decision in the interest of practicality, but not just practicality, but economics too. Because Abram has more than a plan to just get help. This is not just disaster relief. The way he sets this up is actually a plan to expand their wealth and their household exponentially. And this is where we know things have started to go wrong. Because not only has Abram started to abandon the promises of God, he's now operating in his own understanding and his own desires. He's trying to help God along in his plan. We can tell by the nature of the plan itself that Abram is being motivated by a spirit that we've seen in Genesis before, and it's the spirit of not enough. And what I mean is this, church, it's a good diagnostic test for all of us. Even right now, we can know that Abram isn't abiding in his trust of God or acting out of faith because of the strategy it takes to make the trip happen. You see, in Abram's mind, his supply depends on a lie. And that should have been the first clue that we've started to go way off the rails. Anytime we make a decision to go a certain way or do a certain thing, and it requires us to lie or deceive or to cheat or to harm, you can know you're doing something that God has not asked you to do and something that God is not going to approve of you doing. If the plan includes mistrust, you already know the plan didn't come from him. So, now Abram cooks up this plan to exploit the beauty of Sarai for economic gain and diplomatic immunity at the same time. And what you have to realize is that under this patriarchal system, this is a really good plan. The key phrase that we're looking at here is that it may go well with me because of you. Now, Abram is not just going to Egypt to try and get some food to survive. He's going as the part of a larger business scheme. And the scheme hinges on people believing that Sarai is his sister and not his wife. And this makes all the sense in the world, because under that system, the patriarch of the family is responsible for giving away the eligible women in marriage. And the way that this would work is a suitor would come and they would have to bring gifts to curry the favor of the patriarch in order to win him over so that they could marry the object of their affections. So what we have Abram counting on as they go to Egypt is a Prince Ali, Fabulous He, Ali Ababwa situation, where dudes are going to roll up with golden camels, 75 of them. Dudes would show up who had fought 1,000 bad guys with swords and just lavish Abram and his household with gifts and oxen and flocks and gold. He's going to Egypt to get the bag so then he can go back to Canaan. That is his plan. He wants to go to Egypt, have multiple suitors come and give them gifts. He has no intention of actually giving away his wife, but under the system that they're living in, he absolutely holds the upper hand in every single negotiation. This is actually a good plan. It should work. There's only one circumstance or one situation in which this plan isn't a perfect plan. There's only one way that this could go wrong. And it's so small of a possibility that we probably don't even need to mention it. But Abram didn't know Murphy the way I know Murphy, but he was going to. Because in chapter 12, verses 14 through 16, the one way this could go wrong goes wrong. Because there was only one man in all of Egypt in which a discussion between a patriarch and a potential suitor that Abram would not have the upper hand. There's only one person that could come and not play the game that Abram wants to play. And his name was Pharaoh. Pharaoh does not court. Pharaoh is not a suitor. He's just one out of millions, but he just comes and he takes what he wants. So, for the record, Sarai is 65 or so at this time, and I just want to say, go ahead, girl. If you can pull Pharaoh at 65, all right. We got to tip our hat to you. Abram said to her, as all husbands should, I got the baddest girl in the game. But he was too right. She really was an 11 at 65. By the absolute grace and mercy of God, inexplicably to me and how God deals with his people and how he deals with Abram, he curses Pharaoh's house. And in the course of dealing with these plagues, Pharaoh realizes that he's been had and he's a part of this plot by Abram. And only because of what his household is suffering, he doesn't kill Abram due to these divine interventions, and he lets them go. But what a mess Abram has made. Not out of just the promises, not out of just his relationship with God, probably out of his relationship with his wife, his relationship with his entire household at that point too, who followed him to Egypt. The key is going to be found here in verses 14 and 15. We got to come back to it. But what's interesting about this section of text in Genesis is that chapter 12 and 13 actually really go together. Specifically, this blurb about them being in Egypt that ends almost as soon as it begins, and then what happens right after in chapter 13 with Lot, his nephew. And they don't really seem to be connected stories at a surface glance, but they absolutely are. I'm hoping I can help bring that out for you today. Let me just read what happens as soon as they leave this debacle in Egypt, and you'll see what I'm saying. It says, Abram went up from Egypt. They're finally going to go back home, and his wife and all that he had with Lot in him into the Negev. Abram was very rich in livestock, silver, and gold. I wonder if he could even enjoy it. Can you imagine what the trip back to Canaan was like? Have you ever decided that it'll be worth it if I sacrifice my integrity and my character, if I could just get this thing in the process, and then you do that and you get that thing in the process, but you can't even look yourself in the eye anymore, let alone look your wife in the eye anymore, because you gave up too much to get something that you put your hope in that you should have never put your hope in? It was probably a long walk back for Abram back to Canaan. Now, Abram was rich in livestock and silver and in gold, and they journeyed from the Negev as far as Bethel to the place where he had been at the beginning. Hold on to that, family, between Bethel and Ai, to the place where he had made an altar at the first and where Abram had called upon the name of the Lord. He goes all the way back to square one. And Lot, who went with Abram, who had flocks and herds and tents, so that the land could not support both of their dwelling together, for their possessions were so great that they could not dwell together. And there was strife between the herdsmen of Abram's livestock and the herdsmen of Lot's livestock. And at the time, the Canaanites and the Perizzites were dwelling in the land. We went from, at the beginning of this moment, there being a famine, so there is not enough to go around because they don't have enough, to now they have so much that there's not enough to go around because the land can't support them. So we're in a similar conflict for a different reason, coming from a different direction. There's family tension here. We have Abram on the heels of his greatest moral collapse, now retracing all the steps all the way back to Canaan and the very landmarks he's already spent time with before, even to this place that it specifically points out between Bethel and Ai, right where he built the first altar. And he does it again right here. Scripture says he calls on the name of the Lord there. And this is incredibly important. The heart of this whole message is here, but we have to just note it and move on for a second. Some of you might be picking up on the fact that the story into Egypt and out of Egypt seem to be mirroring each other. And maybe your palms are getting sweaty because it's been a few weeks, and your arms are getting itchy because you started to think, is this one of them chiasms he's been going on about for the last 2 months? It is. Ladies and gentlemen, we got another one. If you look at Genesis 12 and verse 8, it says, "From there he went on towards the hills east of Bethel and pitched his tent, Bethel on the west and Ai on the east, and he built an altar and called on the name of the Lord." Then you'll notice that the narrative goes in the exact opposite order, coming out of chapter 12 and into the beginning of chapter 13, right to where he pitches his tent again, calling on the name of the Lord. There are other aspects of this that are mirroring each other all the way down. In the beginning there in chapter 12, it says, "Say you are my sister" to Sarah. And then Pharaoh says to him, "Why did you say she was your sister?" And then he says to Sarah in the beginning of the narrative, "I will be treated well for your sake." And on the other side, it says, Pharaoh indeed treated him well for her sake. And so the center of the chiasm that is built here, flowing in and out, is in verses 14 and 15 of chapter 12. And that's a weird place for me, because that's the moment where Pharaoh realizes what's going on. That's the moment where everything goes off the rails. That's the moment where things start to be revealed. That's the moment where Murphy's Law strikes. It's the moment where they were playing too rough in the backyard, but then someone broke their arm. It's the moment where the scales fell off. It's the moment where Abram realized he really, really screwed this one up. And this is a fascinating point to make the treasure of this entire story, because it's almost as if the author of this wants us to see, number one, Abram not as this infallible superhero of the faith with no flaws, and two, that the important thing that we need to learn from this is how Abram responds when he realizes that he royally messed up. The questions that come out of this are, what does Abram do when things don't go according to plan? What do I do when things don't go according to plan? How does Abram respond when he's been unfaithful to his calling? When he comes back to earth and realizes he's abandoned the promise that God gave him? What is Abram going to do with this lesson? Will he continue to act out of the same fear and insecurity that led him here? Abram has, like every one of us, made a mistake, and a big one. Can God still work with that? Let me read verses 5 through 12 one more time, because this is where it's at. It says, "And Lot went with Abram, had his flocks, herds, and tents, and the land could not support both of them dwelling together. For their possessions were so great they could not dwell together. And there was strife between the herdsmen of Abram's livestock and the herdsmen of Lot's livestock. Abram said to Lot, 'Let there be no strife between you and me, between your herdsmen and my herdsmen, for we are kinsmen. Is it not the whole land before you? Separate yourself from me. If you take the left hand, then I will go to the right. If you take the right hand, then I will go to the left.' And Lot lifted up his eyes and saw the Jordan Valley was well watered everywhere, like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt in the direction of Zoar. So Lot chose for himself all the Jordan Valley, and Lot journeyed east, and they separated from each other. And Abram settled in the land of Canaan, while Lot settled among the cities of the valley, and moved his tent as far as Sodom. Now the men of Sodom were wicked and great sinners against the Lord." I just want to notice here that there's some language that tends to link us to the Egypt story. We've got Abram calling someone a sister who is not a sister in chapter 12. And now in chapter 13, we have Abram calling someone a brother who is not really his brother. Not only can we see that Abram was very crafty because he uses the same term in the Hebrew to denote a close family member. So when he says, "Say you are my sister," it's the same term as when he's speaking of Lot being his brother. It really means close relative. So we know that Abram really played the game several levels down when he went to Egypt. He didn't technically lie, but he lied. You know what I mean? But we also see that we're supposed to be linking these stories together. We're supposed to see something happening in the interplay between them. We have these same principles arising. We left that last story by asking the question, what is Abram going to do with his newfound lesson that he learned? We see in this very next story, he finds himself in a field arguing with Lot. Can you think of another story that we've already talked about with two brothers arguing with each other in the field? How has humanity done so far on this scale? What Abram does is going to be big. Now they're arguing in the field because there's not enough room for everybody. And once again, he's faced with the same problem that he started with in this story, but flipped the other way around. There's not enough to go around. And so Abram's handling of this situation tells us everything we need to know about how his foray into Egypt changed him for the better or for the worse. And I want you to consider before this resolves, why in the world do you think Abram even brought Lot with him to begin with? I mean, didn't God tell Abram to get out from his family and leave his people and go off and strike out on his own? Why has he been lugging Lot around with him through the wilderness and all the way to the promised land this entire time. Think about the promise that Abram has of being a great nation and having many descendants, but he has a barren wife and he knows it. And remember that Abram sees Lot as a brother. He's been promised a bunch of children, but he's not going to have any from where he's sitting. Lot, in Abram's mind, is the only way this family tree is going to continue. He thinks that if God's going to make a great nation out of the descendants of Terah, it's going to be through Lot. So Abram sees Lot in many ways as his legacy, so he's been bringing Lot with him this whole time because he thinks, based on the information that he has, this is the only way that it's going to happen. And with that in mind, it makes their interactions here so much more pivotal. Because we could do an entire lesson on what their interactions are and their ambitions are and how they started with the same heart, but they're beating on two very different wavelengths now. All of this leads up to us seeing Abram's decision to part ways with Lot for being as crazy as it actually is. Because I know where the story is headed. And if you've read through this before, you know where the story is headed. You know how God is going to do what he's going to do. But at this point, Abram has no clue. And you'll see that in the coming weeks because he's going to say to God's face, God, I need something to go on. He has no clue how this is going to happen. Him believing that Lot is the key to his descendants and parting ways with him is crazy. Socially and culturally, it's crazy to leave the patriarch's house. It's a scandal in that world. And then not only this, he lets Lot choose the land that he wants. He's the patriarch. By any stretch of the imagination and by all legality, he gets to choose the land that he wants first. So he's crazy to let Lot go, first of all. Second of all, he's crazy to let this quarreler be the one who chooses. Family, don't miss this because this is important. In one fell swoop, in his mind, Abram gives up both of the things that his hope has been resting in so far. He gives up Lot being a part of his household in the way that he thought God would fulfill his promise of many descendants. And at the same time, he gives up the best land available, the fertile land, the economically prosperous land, of which he has been promised and is rightfully his. He just gives them both up. You see, coming out of Egypt, Abram's heart isn't in those things any longer. Abram is different now. I can't tell you exactly what was in Abram's heart or Abram's mind, but I can give you my best guess after spending time with this. Up until now, Abram has been doing his absolute best to try and follow God, imperfectly as he is. He's been trying his best to hold the tension of the belief and faith that he has that God will do what he promises, and yet not being able to see how it could possibly happen. He's tried to help God out with the plan. He's kept Lot with him. He's gone to Egypt. He's made terrible mistakes. He's just been trying to follow the God the best way that he can based on the information that he has. And I can't fault him for that, but he's got incomplete information. The reason why the center point of these stories is the uh-oh moment, the snap back to reality moment, the Murphy's Law moment, the moment when everything that could go wrong, no matter how small the possibility actually does go wrong, is because every single one of our lives is going to be defined by what we choose to do with those moments. Hear that one more time. Our lives, like Abram's life, are going to be defined by what we choose to do in the moments when things don't go the way we expected them to go. The moments when we realize that we have stepped out of grace, we have stepped out of line, we have stepped out of faith, and we've tried to control a situation that we had no business trying to control. Our inclination as people is usually to blame somebody else, to blame shift, to scheme harder, to self-protect, to self-promote, or we even get arrogant. And Abram certainly could have, because he did come out of Egypt with a whole lot of golden camels. He could have put it as a feather in his cap. Yeah, that was a close call, but it worked out. I think we'll continue right along this same plan. But instead, we see Abram doing something so different here. Now, we have all had that moment when we knew we had been wrong and the bottom fell out and you had to go back and face the one who you betrayed or deal with the consequences of what you had just done. We've all had those moments starting from the time when we were very, very small. I remember on one occasion, I had left, said I was going to be a counselor at church camp. When I got there, they said, we don't need you. And I said, well, I'm just going to hang out with my friends for the week. Mom and Dad will never know until they called the camp and they found out. And now I got to make the 4.5-hour drive home, knowing when I get back, they're going to take my car. They're going to take everything that I love. They're probably going to take my life. This is probably it. And for the first time, I didn't speed on the way home. I took my sweet time. You know what? I think I do need to stop and get lunch. Let me just pull over real quick and grab a pepperoni roll. And we've all been here. Some of y'all probably do this every day, not to out you. You pull up after work and you sit in the driveway, and you're good. I'm going to hang out here for a few minutes. I don't need to go in yet. It's my favorite part of the song. Let me finish this podcast. I know when I walk in the door, the crazy starts. We've all been in these situations in our life where you don't want to go home. You don't want to retrace those steps. You will sit in that car. You will knock on that door as a last possible resort. See, as we mentioned before, Abram retraces every one of his steps, and he goes back to square one. He rewalks the path, along the path, back to the place where his journey started, back to the place where he went off course. He goes back to where it went wrong, and he changes on the way. Abram, walking back to the place where he first called on the name of the Lord, is Abram actually repenting of everything that just happened. He's going back to where he went wrong. He's going back to the heart of worship, if you will. Him going back to that place is him laying down his plans. It's Abram surrendering the way he thought things were going to work. He is doing the thing that none of us ever really want to do. He's repenting. Because Abram has taken a hard lesson that he's learned in Egypt and he's applying it in a positive way. He ends up standing in a field with the same tension he had before, that there's not enough to go around. And this time, he's not going to plan or scheme. This time, he's not going to deceive. This time, he doesn't even choose to exert the right that is his and take the best land that's available. Because Abram is wiser now. Abram knows he's got 3 things and he can't keep them all. He's got a relationship with God. He's got a relationship with his family and Lot. And he's got his wealth. And the last time he had to make this choice, he chose to pursue the wealth at the expense of his relationship with God, and he was willing to put his family in harm's way to see it finished. And he knows now that the only way to do this right is to voluntarily give up his wealth in order to preserve the relationship with his family. And the only way that it honors God is to go this way, this time. He could only do this because he's retraced all those steps. He's repented. He's come back to the heart of worship. What you got to see, guys, before this moment in the story, everything that Abram was operating out of was about the land and about the legacy that he was promised. But now, it's all about the Lord. Before now, he lived out of the promise of the land and the legacy. But he's now reached a place where he's even said, take it. Whatever God wants it to be, it's going to be. I'm going to call on the name of the Lord and see where that gets me. In verse 14, it says, the Lord says to Abram, after Lot had separated from him, lift up your eyes and look at the place where you are, northward, southward, eastward, and westward. For all the land you see, I will give you and your offspring forever. I will make your offspring as the dust of the earth, so that if anyone can count the dust of the earth, your offspring can also be counted. Arise and walk through the length and breadth of the land, for I will give it to you. So Abram moved his tent and came and settled by the oaks of Mamre, which are at Hebron, and there he built an altar to the Lord. Imagine putting yourself in Abram's place when he just gave up Lot, the thing that he thought God would use to fulfill his promise. That God immediately comes to him after and says, hey, I'm going to make your descendants as the sands of the earth. You know, it's funny how when Abram set his heart on the Lord, he ended up getting the land and the legacy thrown in. Do you know that's true in your life too, church? Every single promise God has made to you is on the other side of you putting him at the center of your heart. Every single one. Just as Abram and Lot stood and looked out from a high place, and Abram gave up what was promised for the sake of another, God chose Abram, and God was able to still work through Abram, despite his greatest failures, because he had learned, he had changed, and he's now another picture of how Jesus was going to choose us, because some of you may remember that years later, God in the flesh, Jesus Christ, would be led up to a high place to look over all the kingdoms of the earth, and he was told, you can have them right now. But to do it, he would have to do it at the expense of his relationship with God and his relationship with us. And he made the choice like Abram made, to give it up. For you. For me. I don't do this often, family. You know this if you've been here with us for a while, but this has got to be a personal message for you. Because there's some of us in this moment right now, in person or watching this later, who are right where Abram was. You've tried your best in earnest to follow God, and sometimes you have sacrificed. You have really tried. You really have. You believe the promises of God. You really do. You hold to them as best you can, but you feel a tension between your faith and your ambitions and your responsibilities. And in this life, in this Murphy's Law riddled life, it is sometimes very hard to see how God is going to make it happen. And maybe you've made some plans along the way to try and help God get it done, or you've just done what you thought you could do with the information that you had. But things have not gone how you planned or hoped. Things have gone horribly wrong. You've compromised. You've compensated. You've made mistakes. You've been distracted by your desire for lands and for legacy. You've even put family relationships at risk. Your kids never see you. Your wife never feels you. Your parents never hear from you. Your friends don't know you anymore. And despite your best efforts, you've created your own worst moments. You never intended to get this far off track, but here we are. You plan to go back to Canaan. But to go back to Canaan, you'd have to retrace all of those steps and admit you were wrong. You'd have to repent. And so often it's easy to just keep moving forward and pretend that it didn't happen. Say, I'm going to learn my lesson, not make that mistake again. But you want to do it without coming to the place where you went off the rails and calling on the name of the Lord and saying, I give up the legacy, I give up the lands, I just need the Lord. It got away from you, and then you got away from God. Maybe not even physically, because you're sitting here today. But what about in here? Do you feel it, church? Do you feel him tugging on you? Can you hear the call? Are the promises of God as real to you as they ever were? And you might be thinking about moments in your life that you feel like disqualify you, but I want you to look close at what we studied today. Nothing could be further from the truth, because what made Abram great was not that he never fell short. It's that when he realized that he was willing to retrace those steps in repentance right back to where he should have always been, resting in the Lord, trusting in his promises, and calling on his name. That's what made Abram's faith great. That's why even after a monumental moral collapse, God could look at Abram, put him on a high place and say, yeah, I can still work with that because you're letting me work on you. You're letting me work in you. And that means I can work through you. And that means it's the exact same thing for you too. Each and every one of us, if you just walk those steps back and you learn from them and you come back to the heart and you repent and you call on the name of the Lord, he always answers. We don't have an altar here, but I'm still going to call you to it. And I think it's important for us to be encouraged to take a step out of Egypt, whatever Egypt is for us, the place where we made a plan with the best of intentions and the wrong ambitions. and take a step back towards the place that we never should have left. And I would encourage you to do that today. If you're here and you've never taken a step toward God in the first place, and you feel that now, it's a great day. And if you're taking a step away, it's a great day to take a step back, whatever that step looks like for you. I would ask you to come as we stand and sing.